Hello and welcome to the Pagan Portal podcast, produced by Moonbooks Publishing, presented by me, Rachel Patterson. If you prefer an audio-only version, hop on over to Spotify. If you'd like early access to all of the YouTube goodies, then please consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button. So, after all that blurb, today we welcome educator, activist and writer Susan Harper. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So we start, as always. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, I've had a kind of long and winding road to finally getting a book out. I am an educator, an activist, an advocate, a ritualist, a tarot reader, and about 1,000 other things. I'm located now in the greater Des Moines, Iowa area in the U.S., although I started out in another area of the Midwest and then spent 30 years in Texas as a witch, which, if you know anything about Texas politics, was pretty interesting.
Okay.
I have a PhD in anthropology, and I actually got to study contemporary paganism in the U.S. South for my dissertation. So I'm really lucky that I've gotten to both have my personal practice and then get a lot of time exploring it really deeply in a scholarly way. And that really informs how I work. I work in higher education, which in the U.S. is also an interesting thing to be doing right now. I'm not faculty. I'm actually staff at a large state university, and I do student programming and oversee a couple scholarship programs, and also am the person to whom every student with questions about paganism is sent. The grapevine works that way. And I do a lot of tarot workshops and things in my local community. And when I'm not doing that, my wife and I and our two very spoiled felines live in a house in a small town kind of north of where my university is. And we cultivate a small and wild garden and otherwise kind of try to enjoy a quiet life at this point in our lives.
It's the anthropology thing fascinates me. If I had my time again, I think I would I'd be down that route, and archaeology as well, and digging up stuff and investigating. It all sounds fascinating.
It is. I sometimes joke that it was the only job I could find, or the only major I could find where being super nosy was a job skill.
Definite qualification.
Yes. The nosier you are, the better an interviewer you are. So, my father actually had thwarted dreams of being an Egyptologist. So that was what kind of started me on that road, and the encouragement to be just insatiably curious about the world.
Yeah.
And that actually is one of the things that led me to find paganism and witchcraft as well. Just being very curious about how the world works, and what is our place in it, what all is out there, and then couple that with always being told, if you're interested, you go to the library and you find out. And
the library.
Here I am.
Many hours spent in the library.
It's my favorite bookstore.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. My dad used to take us to the library every week without fail. Yeah.
I still go to the library every week. I have a good one here in my town. So
brilliant. Yes. They're very underrated. We need to shout out for libraries, definitely. Yes. And you can get all of the Moonbooks books from libraries too, people, just in case you want it. If they haven't got it, ask them. They'll get it.
Yes. We're working with my library to make sure I have a copy. I actually do my tarot workshops through the public library here in rural Iowa. Who knew?
Excellent.
So
yeah, brilliant.
There's a lot of interest. The rooms are always packed. So I'm hoping to be able to do an author event with them.
I think even people that aren't pagan or spiritual are often intrigued by tarot, though, aren't they?
Absolutely. I get all walks of life. All walks of life.
So you mentioned witchcraft. Is that, for want of a better word, a label that you put yourself under? Is that how you describe your spiritual pathway?
Yeah, I describe myself. I will, if I'm in a space where people kind of understand the word Wicca, I will use it. It's not really accurate, but for kind of passing interaction, it works. But I prefer the word witchcraft. I either call myself a witch. Sometimes I'll refer to myself as a goddess woman because that works. But I talk about it actually in the book. I think that reclaiming the word witch, especially for women and femme folks, is super important because it's a word that's been used to hurt us a lot. And I remember reading where Starhawk talked about that when I was I was probably 19, and that it kind of hit me where I lived, and I've used that word for myself ever since. Even when it was a far less socially acceptable word to use, it was really important for me to use it.
Yeah, we do. We need to reclaim it, don't we? Definitely.
And it's inherently political. It's a claiming of power, and so I think we need to use it and claim it back from the pejorative.
Is that where your spiritual journey began, with Starhawk, with that discovery? Or was it before then?
It kind of started, it was this very circular kind of path because it was the late 80s and the early 90s in a small town in the upper Midwest of the US. So not a lot of access to these ideas. I had been intrigued by tarot and sort of the mystical my entire life. And I was raised by a mom that was a pretty fundamentalist Christian and a dad who was an atheist. So to say that those things were not encouraged in my childhood home it's mild. Although both my parents were had different sort of psychic gifts and completely accepted that was real. They both talked to dead people and had precognition and
like you do.
Yeah. And I'm the youngest of 9 kids, and we've all got it too. So
wow,
I'm really fortunate that wasn't sort of like encouraged out of me. So when I started to explore, I had that, but there was actually an article in 17 magazine when I was in high school, this like teen girl magazine.
I remember those magazines.
And I couldn't believe it. She was a girl who had been raised Wiccan, and that was kind of the hook, right? And I read that and went, well, that's interesting. And within about 6 months, there was actually an article in our local paper about a kind of a lawsuit that had been ongoing in the South Dakota State Penitentiary of all places. There was a Wiccan coven that had formed inside, and they were trying to get access to ritual tools, which at the time was really, really hard to do. And so they gave the guy who was kind of the founder gave an interview, and I went, well, that's intriguing. How can I find out more about that? And that kind of went a whole lot of nowhere until I went to college. I started reading tarot when I was 17. I had access to that. But I just kind of like, okay, well, whatever. If I ever get a chance to find out more about this witchcraft thing, I will. And when I went to college, it actually so happened that the woman who ended up being my best friend for over 30 years until she passed away last fall, I met her my first week of college, and she was Wiccan. And I picked her up from work one night and had an hour in the car with her and peppered her with questions the entire time. And she was very patient. Love you, Mary. I miss you. And presented me actually with Scott Cunningham's Wicca for the Solitary Practitioner, which was a new book at the time and incredibly controversial here in the US. The idea that you could practice by yourself. So she gave me that, and I started sort of digging, because now I had a bookstore I could go to. And I ended up with Starhawk, ended up with a few things, read everything I could get my hands on. And that meant reading a lot of stuff that was probably kind of sketchy. Got a hold of a copy of the Modern Witch's Spellbook in 1994.
There's still a lot of sketchy stuff out there.
Was very quickly warned about the Frosts, because that was a book that was available, and we didn't want to be doing that. And it kind of so happened that when we came back to school the next year, we were living in the same residence hall, and our front desk worker who was a woman in her 30s, asked if we wanted to come to a spring equinox circle. And so we went. And I got there and I was like, well, this is all women. Okay. This kind of fine, right? And I will never forget it because they called the circle and they invoked the goddess, and I waited for them to invoke the god and they didn't do it. And I was like, oh, you can do that. Oh, wow.
Revelation.
Oh. And we did sort of the Persephone and Demeter cycle because it was a spring equinox, and they talked about it in these feminist terms about sort of like reclaiming power and what it is to as a woman to go through these underworld journeys. And my life changed. I was hooked. I tell people that I came for the magic and I stayed for the politics.
Perfect. Yeah.
And that has been my journey over the last 30 years, even through some of the things the goddess movement and the feminist craft movement have gone through in the US, which has, profoundly broken my heart sometimes. I really believe that the politics and the ecological politics, the feminist politics and witchcraft are just inextricably linked for me. I couldn't pull them apart if I tried. And I know that that's not how everybody thinks about it, but I actually have been writing about it recently that I kind of think that that's what kind of prepared me to meet this moment in U.S. history. And it started me on the path of thinking in terms of systems and how things were interlocked and how oppressions and power were connected. And then that, when I was spit out into my intro to anthropology class, like for a lot of folks, they become an anthropologist first and a witch second. And for me, it was backwards. And my scholarship was a extension of my spirituality in that way, because it was these two holistic worldviews that really worked together.
It's always interesting to hear people's journeys to get to where we are. There's always a common thread running through it, but each person has their own individual bits and pieces that make it all happen as well.
And that was actually what my doctoral dissertation was on. I took people's stories.
See, I knew, obviously. Our brains are linked already, obviously.
Yep. I was like, I want to know.
Now, you've used the word feminist a couple of times, and that's the title of your new book, which is Feminist Witchcraft. For the benefit of anyone that doesn't know, how would you define feminist witchcraft?
That's a great question, because the word feminist has about 1,000 different definitions, and some of them are great and some of them are not. To take a feminist lens means that we recognize, one, that the world is interlocking and complex. But if we want to sort of have a social analysis, we generally had to pick a lens to come through. And for me to be a feminist is that I approach things from a lens that's about gender first, and then looks to see how gender is intertwined with everything else. And for me too, that means really problematizing the idea of gender, that it's not just women and men, although that came later. That was definitely when I first started. We were talking about women and men. We weren't talking about trans folks. We weren't talking about any of that in mainstream culture, and I've had to evolve around that. So for me, feminist witchcraft is a witchcraft that places the experiences of really anybody who's not men at the center. And although men can be feminist witches too, but looks at the way in which that particular sort of cultural complex has been used, in particular alongside the kind of exploitation of the earth, and that within the sort of liberation of women and other marginalized genders, that is tied up with kind of a different way of how we live upon this planet and how we treat each other, how we treat the earth, how we treat the animals. So it's this sort of idea that not to sort of be very simplistic, but that the way that we treat this planet and the way that we treat women they mirror each other. And we have to, if we want to have a better way, a more sustainable way of living for just everything that lives on this planet, we have to address both those things. And the other sort of piece that drew me to feminist witchcraft and where it fits into my definition is that it is a practice that it is about political change in the world, and it's also about healing the wounds of patriarchy and using witchcraft for that. What was so powerful about the first women's circles I went to in some goddess craft, or what we euphemistically called women's spirituality back in those days in the U.S., was circles of women talking about things that we're not supposed to talk about. And now I know, now they're an extension of sort of secular feminist consciousness raising in the 70s. But these were women who were using witchcraft and herbs and energy and all that to heal things like, the injuries of sexual violence, the injuries of sexism. I've since been in circles where we talk about, using craft to heal the ancestral and current wounds of racism for folks of color that experience that. The idea that these tools could be used to help heal real world problems. And then as more healed people, we go out to try to work to make the world better. And I loved that sort of dance between public and private, and the willingness to pull things out of the shadows in a very intentional way. I think any witchcraft circle could do those things if they wanted to, but for feminist witchcraft, that is a huge piece of what we do. And if you go and you get any of the kind of classic, women's or feminist spell books, right alongside what you would expect, you find spell work or healing work for these things that patriarchy does to us, and the kind of recognition that witchcraft is one way of taking your power back. And it's been a access to power for women and other people that aren't cisgendered and heterosexual men for a long time. And that's why the word witch was weaponized. They don't want us telling our stories. They don't want us being powerful. And when we are able to step into our power, especially collectively, we have the ability to shift a lot of things. So nice, simple definition. Just put it on a magnet.
I think witchcraft is life-changing, isn't it? It is.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So do it, everyone.
Yes.
Just do it.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It can be in so many ways. And it's sort of this conversation that I have, and I talk about it in the book, that, any kind of witchcraft can be practiced through a liberatory lens. Absolutely. It doesn't have to be. And here in the US for a long time, people would say, I just don't like to mix my politics and religion. And I'm like, I got bad news for you, my friend. I don't know what to tell you.
Let's look at history.
Right. I do not know what to tell you. And the word witch has always been political. It's always been about power. And so finding something where that was in the center was huge, especially for me at the point in my life in which I found it. I had a lot of wounds of patriarchy that needed to be healed and had no idea how to do it as a 19-year-old girl, and was now suddenly in these circles of women who were at various places on their journeys, but at least they were a chapter ahead of me. And I stepped into this community of women who cared about other women, which is not always as easy to find as one might think.
Oh no, no.
And we're trying to, divest from things like diet culture and things like slut shaming.
We don't mention the D word.
Oh.
Don't do the D word.
Oh no, right?
No.
And I had no idea people talked about these things. I had no idea, and I didn't have the language. And these women helped to give me that language, and that sent me down the road of trying to understand what feminism was. I have a degree in women's studies too, and it's all their fault. and wanting to kind of see how these things were connected. I'm a Sagittarius. I want to understand things with my brain and my heart. And it was like, I don't know who I would be had I not stumbled into that living room.
Yeah.
When I was 19, I have no idea who I would be.
Yeah.
It was definitely a moment that I like date my life from before and after.
Yeah. You'd probably still be looking if you hadn't found it.
Who knows? Who knows?
I think the term feminist comes with a lot of misconceptions anyway. Does feminist witchcraft have its own misconceptions? Are there some common ones that you want to dispel?
Absolutely. I think the biggest one that happens in the US, and it is unfortunately grounded in a reality that is practiced by some groups, is that it is exclusionary to trans women. And that has been, it's one of the things about some of the writers who changed my life also broke my heart when I realized that they had a very narrow definition of who was allowed in women's spaces. I talk about it in the book, in the spaces that I'm in, and increasingly in the more feminist and politicized witchcraft spaces I'm in. It's very clear that if we're talking about women, we're also talking about trans women. And even to open that conversation to talk about non-binary folks who feel most comfortable in the spaces that foreground the experience of women and trans people. So that's huge. And that's probably the one that I have to dispel the most often, especially if I host like a public moon circle or something like that. I have to be very clear in my language that it is an open and welcoming space. And I've done a little writing about the things that I learned as a facilitator, things that I had never questioned until I had people who were in my community that said, oh, actually. So that is a big one. There's the assumption that I think just goes with feminists that like we all hate men. And I'm like, well, first of all, way to make everything about you. Like if being a feminist is first and foremost it's reassuring men that you don't hate them, you've made it about men, and that stinks. Men can be feminists too. And some feminist witchcraft circles welcome men and some don't. I have done both over my time. So I think that idea is really important, or that to be in a feminist witchcraft space, you have to be a lesbian. And there were some circles in the early days where you had to either be a lesbian or a non-practicing heterosexual woman, which that is not something that's ever been part of my practice. I have been in circles that were primarily lesbian and bisexual women, but not because we asked you at the door. I'm like, how would we even prove that? Like,
I'm just wondering how you would prove it.
I was like, okay, you say you're a lesbian. Here's an IKEA bookshelf. You have 15 minutes. Like what?
Oh no, I can build flat packs.
See, that's the thing, right? You're bisexual? Sit in this chair. Both your feet are on the floor. Get out of here. I don't know how we would even do that. But it is a misconception, and it sometimes, I think, keeps women and other folks who would really benefit from those spaces from being in them.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's also an idea that this is something that's just for white women, and a lot of early spaces were very white, but there were also women of color, particularly Black women, who were writing in a feminist witchcraft space right alongside a lot of those things in the 90s. And they had a lot of focus on, reclaiming root work and ancestral traditions here in the US. And I think it's important to know that that's there. And now, I mean, paganism in the US is getting less white than it historically has been. Although,
we are over here. I think, yeah.
Maybe that's my next anthropological study. There's a lot of there.
Yeah.
But it is not inherently sort of a white woman's practice. As a white woman who facilitates these spaces, I've had to learn a lot, and have been lucky to have people in my community who've helped me grow in that way. Because you only know what you know, and to incorporate perspectives from women and and non-binary folks whose like lived experience is not mine, so that the spaces we create together can still be empowering, has been a huge sort of journey. I find less of the like really negative stereotypes now. Like I remember actually one of the ones that struck me, and I still laugh about it because it was so out of pocket, is I said something about being a feminist witch, and it was another woman who said to me, I was like, oh, so you're there are those women who like free bleed in the woods and think the only thing that's important about you is your vagina, right? And I was like,
were you polite in your answer?
I was like, I don't even know how to get a toehold on this. I was like, well, I guess that's a thing. And certainly in a lot of feminist circles, especially back in the 70s and the 80s, where it was very like radical with small r feminism that looked at the belief that there was a biological, like fundamental biological differences between how men and women show up in the world. There was a lot of work around reclaiming bodily processes like menstruation, like childbirth, and that's important, right? And so it's like, well, okay, so we talk about those things with the recognition that not every woman menstruates, not everybody who menstruates a woman, but like it's not really the focus of what we do. And if that's what you've run into by being practiced by people who use the same words for their practice as I do, and if that hurt you, like I'm sorry that happened, but I kind of think it probably didn't. I think it was probably one of those things. It's this game of telephone. That like what are they doing out there? These women in the woods. So and there is something that can be very primal about some of the gatherings I've gone to. Like I've run through the woods under the full moon and howled. Hell yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's just general witchcraft.
That's just general
doesn't
witchcraft.
Everybody
Again,
do that? I don't know.
And it's sort of this sort of interesting thing when I first started going to large kind of pan-pagan gatherings. And people would say like, if you're a man, stay away from the word that's used a lot of times because it's the word that Z Budapest used to describe her feminist witchcraft is Dianic. And people would say, oh, if you're a man, stay away from the Dianics. They'll never see you. We'll never see you again. It's sort of this, like it was sort of a witchier extension of feminist bashing. And those Dianics, if you shave your legs, they won't let you in. Like that kind of stuff.
That was exactly where my mind was going. That's all the myths I've heard.
Which I'm like, okay, like, but I run into less of that. Like sometimes people will joke with me, but I run into less of that now. In the same way that I spent a lot of my first years educating about witchcraft, starting with the like, now we're not Satanists.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And now I have to explain to people like, oh, we hang out with the Satanic Temple all the time. It's cool.
Yes, they're really rather nice people.
Well, and they are so explicitly political.
Yeah.
That they are actually kind of a natural affinity for people like me.
Yep.
Which, I don't tell 1995 me because she'd faint.
Yeah.
But like I have noticed over the years, like as there's more understanding of, it's generally an understanding of Wicca in the US, like the things that we talk about have changed. And it used to be that there was an idea that if you were a man, you couldn't be a witch of any stripe, right? And that has changed too. So it's just sort of this evolving sort of question. Nobody, I don't think, thinks that we sacrifice men in the woods anymore to the goddess of the moon. So
not regularly.
Regularly. I mean, that gets exhausting.
It's fluid though, isn't it? I think witchcraft is fluid. How I practiced 30 odd years ago is different now. There's more available now for a start.
So much more.
Like I learned pre-internet, so it was just whatever you could get your hands on, basically.
Yes, I was at that point where like the internet was. I'd been practicing witchcraft for a year and a half before I got my first email address.
Yeah,
and then it was bulletin boards.
Yes,
right.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we were starting to have some of that, since pagans and science fiction geeks are always the early adopters of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
That Venn diagram isn't quite a pancake, but it's close.
Yeah.
And it was enough that you could find people to talk to that could send you down, you know, a very short rabbit hole, because there just wasn't that much available.
No.
Especially here in the US. So yeah, it was that sort of interesting place. And I think about now, like the number of times I drove out into small town Texas to go attend a moon circle that I saw advertised. I didn't know these people.
No. Just an advert on a pinboard in the library or a shop or
just
something.
enough. You know, my best friend, my late best friend, we came up in the craft together, and we were invited by one of the women from kind of the feminist spirituality community in Dallas to come to this full moon in this. It's not a small town anymore, but it was this little bitty small town in Texas. And we were early enough that we didn't know that you pack your ritual robes and you change when you get there. So, you know, we're doing the whole thing, and we realized that we're lost. And it was a Friday night in a small Texas town where the public religion is football, American football. And we had to stop at the gas station, and I was just like,
all dressed up.
What is going to happen? Oh my God, we're going to die. And so I was like, all right, I'll go in. If I don't come back, like, call my dad, you know? And I walked in, and I went to the cash register, and I will never forget it, because the guy looked me up and he looked me down and he said, "Oh, you're looking for Janie and Roger's house.
Oh,
You took a left where you should have took a right about 3 blocks back."
Brilliant. Brilliant.
But I didn't know these people.
No.
And we did it over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And now it's so much different. I mean, I could have gone to that circle online probably if it was happening now.
Now, you mentioned the goddess. Is she a focal point of feminist witchcraft specifically?
Yeah, she is. There's generally not like the sort of Wiccan goddess dyad is just not something you see in a lot of feminist circles. Some do. And some will like to work with gods that transcend gender. But the craft that I came up in was goddess centered, which was the other sort of appeal for me. It was an alternative to the kind of like angry patriarchal god I had sort of grown up with. And early on, somebody exposed me to Mary Daly, where she said, when God is a man, the man becomes God. And that was one of those like moments. So for some feminist witchcraft groups, they might choose a patron goddess, or think in a more like hard polytheist kind of way where there's 44 gods and 44 goddesses. For some feminist witchcraft groups, it's more the idea of the goddess as kind of the divine feminine principle. And increasingly, as we have more people who are atheistic in the goddess community and the pagan community generally in the US, the way that we talk about it really evolves. But that's the central idea of deity, and generally speaking, not deity that is separate from us, but separate deity that is reflected in us. Because the whole idea is, Jean Shinoda Bolen's book got really used in a lot of early feminist spirituality, the goddesses in every woman kind of situation, and that we're all reflections, and that by reclaiming goddess-centered language for the divine and sort of divesting ourselves of the patriarchal Christian God, that is also part of recognizing the like innate holiness of women and anybody who's not a man. I would just assume women and asterisks, right? I try to be very clear in my language, but I also know it's gonna edit this. Because one of the like original sins, I think, is looking at any group of people and saying like, there's a God and you don't look like them. And because that's such a step of disempowering people. And so that is where the goddess focus really comes in. And then of course, so many of the myths and stories are are allegories for the cycles of life, and particularly for the cycles of like women's lives. And to bring those back in is a way of healing patriarchy, of healing mother wounds. So it all kind of like braids together. Early on in my journey, I took an art history class and I saw my first picture of the Venus of Willindorf. And I was like, oh my gosh, like.
She looks like me.
Well, at first I was like, oh my gosh, like
or I look like her. Yeah.
She's so ugly. And a friend of mine said, no, she's beautiful and she's you.
No, she curves. Yeah, we like curves.
And then I immediately wanted to go to Vienna and steal her. I did not. But it did start a lifelong collection of little fat Neolithic and Paleolithic goddesses everywhere in the house.
I love them.
They're just they're wonderful.
I definitely model myself after her. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Like it was this really like they're just these moments. When I realized that sort of like my body could be a goddess body.
Much better than the images that you get most of the time now of the goddess. If you do a Google search for the goddess, it's not what we look like.
I call a lot of what's out there softcore priestess porn.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, nailed it.
Which is totally a way of, I'm writing about this right now, the way in which capitalism recognizes that witchcraft is a path to empowerment. And so it has to defang it and make it something we can sell. I say as I'm trying to sell a book, but it has to like it go through this. I mean, my commie friends would call it, capitalist recuperation, because it's dangerous, especially because we can be. I mean, I'm talking to how many people all over the world, right? When this podcast goes live, there are conversations that the mythical they don't want us to have. And I've watched it happen. There was this, resurgence of interest in political witchcraft after Trump was elected the first time. And then you sort of scope back and watch and you're like, oh, in about 2018, we start getting this very commercialized, very sanitized. Witchcraft is just about personal wellness. And it's like, it totally was about trying to suck the power out. And a lot of that is sold to women. And I'm like, all right, for some of us, it's a path to empowerment. It's where we start, but it can also be a way of sort of like treat yourself. If you just have a great little cottagecore life, everything will take care of itself. And it's like, no, I need you to go beyond. So I've been doing some work about that. Maybe I'll write a book about it someday, but it's fascinating to watch it in real time. I love wellness. Witchcraft can be for wellness, but that's not all it's for.
But so many other things. So actually within the feminist witchcraft, is there a structure of practice?
Oh, that's a great question. And it really varies. So many, including the groups that I came up in and roughly the way I practice now, many sort of feminist witchcraft circles have a very Wiccan structure in that, there's the solstices and the equinoxes and the cross quarter days. And the sort of the mythic cycle is about the life cycle of the goddess herself rather than kind of a reproductive cycle. Most groups will recognize the full moons and the new moons as really important, but that's not universal. And I've watched that change, especially as more information and more choice comes available. I mean, I think a lot of U.S. witchcraft and even contemporary paganism more largely, and I write about this in my dissertation, are very Wicca based because that's what we had access to. That's what we could find. We had Starhawk, we had Cunningham. If you wanted to go back and get sort of the get Gardner's books, you could, because it's a clear lineage. But I have seen that shift a lot. Like I've been invited to participate in feminist witchy circles that they just happen on a random Wednesday because that's a good idea. A friend of mine calls hers Woo Wednesdays. I love it. and it's a chance to get together and say, maybe we're going to drum, or maybe we're all going to, sit in a space and crochet and, talk about politics, and at the end, maybe do some spell work about it. So what I like about it is it's very free flowing, and certainly my practice has changed over time. From being in a lot of groups to being solitary to being, kind of all over the place. And because one of my favorite definitions of what it is to be a witch is actually from Starhawk, and she said a witch is someone who's paying attention. And so to me, like, because I approach the world with my politics always, and I'm paying attention, like anything can be part of my spiritual practice. And sometimes, like, if it's just me, I don't want to cast a whole circle in my living room. Like, I don't want to do it. So I will, if I'm going to engage in spell work or meditation work or herb work, it can be very informal. And it just varies so much.
I think mine started with Wicca as well. Like I say, it was the only thing that was around when I started. And I think the structure of ritual in particular from the Wiccan training tends to be the one that most groups use because it works generally, I guess. But I think the further you get down your pathway, the more experience you do tailor it to suit your own needs, don't you? And yeah, like yourself, sometimes I think, no, I can't be bothered to do that. We'll just get on with the spell work. Right. Forget all the fancy stuff.
Yeah, it's very like and it's a sort of an interesting thing. 'Cause, like, this is the danger of being a scholar about something you also like practice. Is the more I learned about the kind of the 19th and early 20th century occult movement that gave birth to guys like Gardner and guys like Crowley, I'm like, okay, so there's some stuff here that's kind of like colonialistic weird. Like, if I'm going to say that I'm a feminist, what are we doing here? But I think you're right. That structure, it works. And it's also, especially when you're talking about doing like public ritual.
Yes.
It's common enough for people to know what the heck is happening.
Yeah. Everyone's familiar with it.
Everyone's familiar with them.
Yeah.
And there is something to be said for that. And like, ultimately it works. Like there is a difference when I'm in a space where we've cast circle and where we haven't. Even if the casting is very simple, just the fact that generally we don't have physical temples and churches. And I love that we create our sacred space wherever we are to have that time. I'm trying to remember who said it, but there's a quote that I love that says there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places that have been profaned. And I think about that a lot. But taking the time to mark out, like, for your brain, like, we're doing this now, that's a reason why, religions all over the world create delineated spaces. So, and having that, especially given some of the internal work that happens in feminist witchcraft circles, to set that as like a container and a very like, this is a space in which we can be extra vulnerable, and where like these kind of boundaries explicitly indicate, what's said in circle stays here. I think that can be really, really important, especially early on in practice, when you're trying to like just kind of suss out how that all feels.
Start with the basics. Yep. And then tailor it.
Exactly.
Which kind of leads me to, do you have any words of wisdom for anyone looking to start their journey in feminist witchcraft?
Yeah. Witchcraft is for everybody. Mm. And there's a sort of very famous, it comes out of a feminist art collective where most of them weren't actually witches, but they called themselves Witch, which was a Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and I love it. And in the late 60s or early 70s, they all dressed up as like the canonical witch with the hat, and they did a collective hex on Wall Street. And I love that, right? But they have a very long manifesto about what it means to be a witch. And they were talking only in terms of women, but leave that aside. But it culminates in saying that you're a witch by looking in a mirror and saying to yourself 3 times, I'm a witch, and then really believing yourself. And I love that. So witchcraft is for everybody. I think, and I would give this advice to anybody, whether wanting to explore feminist witchcraft or any other kind of witchcraft, read deeply and, ask questions, but also sort of trust your gut. That one of the things I loved about the feminist witchcraft circles I came up in is there wasn't a formal initiatory structure. Like who was the priestess changed based on the Sabbath, based on the moon, that we were all, that there was a real flattening of power hierarchy. And so you don't have to know a certain amount of stuff to be able to practice, experiment with things. I take my craft seriously. Yeah. But part of taking my craft seriously is also being willing to just find the joy and the absolute silliness in it sometimes.
Absolutely.
That this can be a real path to healing and power and really powerful community if you want to find it. I could be selfish and say, well, start with my book. But I will be honest.
That's not selfish. Just definitely start with your book.
Well, and the thing is that I wrote the book I wished I had when I was 19.
Right. Excellent.
But then you go and you read as much as you can, consume as much content, use your discernment, but content online, find community. Which can be complicated depending on where you are, but also know that if it's only ever you, your practice is really valid. And I also like go read all kinds of feminist theory too, but that can come second. You do not have to have a women's studies degree to practice this. And in talking to one of my good friends that I practice with, is we always say, when we think about who we want to bring into our small circle, is bring me somebody whose politics are pretty good and I can teach them the witchcraft, so it's the idea that, to think deeply about the world and what you care about and bring that to your craft. Cause that's what witches, and not just kind of Western pagan witches, is what witches have always done, is recognize that we're inherently powerful. But start with my book. Take what works and leave what doesn't. My Southern friends would say, take the meat and leave the bones. And I like to, because a lot of feminist witches are vegetarians. You don't have to be, but a lot of them are. And so I like to say, take the tofu and leave the package. Whatever's going to be nourishing for you, take it with you. And I think if your practice is only ever spending time in nature and speaking out about causes you believe in, that's a great place to start.
Whatever works for you. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things I love about witchcraft. You can tailor it, can't you, to work for you?
Yes.
Yes.
We're having some really good conversations in the US, and I don't know if they're happening in the UK as well, about making witchy and pagan spaces accessible for people with disabilities. Because that
my own coven does a lot online. Yeah, because it does. It opens up to everyone.
It opens things up. Things about both as folks in our community age, and just as more folks kind of come into the fold, thinking about what we tell people is required, or this is how this works, or thinking differently about those things is really important. And I think that's, for me, that's part of the feminist part of my craft, is thinking about there's always who's at the table, who's not at the table, who wants to be at the table, and who's being kept away from the table. And so I think about, in my own sort of, especially public events, part of my political consciousness is thinking about what would be the barrier here, and trying to think beyond those things. And that's that is, that's just really key. And I've watched those conversations change a lot, even over the last 10 years, about how we think about those things and how we question some of our assumptions in the name of like a more affirming and more inclusive and more liberatory community. And I love being part of those conversations because I learn a lot. I get to share the things that I've learned, and I think it makes us all better.
So very quickly, as we're running out of time,
Yes.
any new projects you're working on?
Yes, I'm doing a couple of things. So my big project right now is I'm working on a book proposal that would expand a journal article that I wrote looking at how we construct an ethics of abortion within contemporary pagan ethics and theology. And it's based mostly in the US just because that's what I know and how that debate has been framed. I think it's really important now. I know here in the US, contemporary pagans tend to be very pro-abortion access, but also talk about that we're life affirming. And that was how I got started. So I am working on that book proposal with an eye towards hopefully getting that book out in like 2027. And I'm doing a lot of tarot workshops here in my local Des Moines and Ames, Iowa area, but looking at getting those put online as well. And I never know what else I'm going to get into. And then, of course, all the promotional things for the book, which I'm super excited about.
It's been fascinating talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you to all the listeners and the watchers as well. Do look out for the new book, Feminist Witchcraft, from Moonbooks Publishing. And we will see you all again next time on the Pagan Portal Podcast. Thank you so much, everyone.
You have been listening to the Pagan Portal Podcast, a Moonbooks Publishing production. For more information, please visit our website.